billions of dollars that were about to be, provided to communities all across the country has been canceled. Right.
Welcome to Thinking Through. Today, we're inviting conversations on digital equity and how it connects to emerging technologies like AI. My guest, Dr. Colin Rhinesmith, a scholar who's been at the forefront of digital equity research and someone who's helped build collaborations between researchers, communities, and practitioners, is here to help me think this through. Thank you, Colin, for being on the show and helping me think through this topic.
Yeah, thank you so much, Allison. It's great to be here.
And before we dive in, I would love to begin by having you share how you define digital equity and what sits inside that term for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. In my work, I tend to follow the definition from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, which has talked about it as really sort of an outcome or goal of digital inclusion work that allows people to have really, they refer to it as sort of the capacity, the individual's capacity to be able to engage with technology in a way that sort of fulfills their life. I think what's interesting about that is while it certainly is an outcome of the work, I think in my work in the organization that I have started at the University of Illinois, my lab, the DEAR Lab, or the Digital Equity Action Research Lab, I think about it also as a process. So not just as an outcome, but as a process as well.
Okay. That's really helpful to begin that groundwork and with that, because I've been thinking about it as well and listening to you. I keep returning to this idea that digital equity isn't just about having access to broadband tools. It's also about who holds agency, who gets a seat at that table and who has ownership over these technologies. I've been thinking a lot about that.
Absolutely. So what's the process? As you mentioned, it's more than just broadband access or access to the internet, but it's also digital literacy skills, right? Once you have access to devices to connect to a broadband network, it's also about those skills. And so, that is really what, from the perspective of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance and other digital inclusion practitioners who do this work every day in communities, like working in public libraries or other organizations.
I was just thinking about how important public libraries are,
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really why I'm in the field that I'm in, because public libraries are really on the front lines, right, of helping people who can't afford access to technology. But I think there's a lot more room, and I appreciate how you've talked about this as well, is that there is a lot more room to think about the equity piece of digital equity to make sure that we are centering equity in this work. And happy to talk more about that.
Yeah, let's talk more about that. Let's dive into let's go into it. And can we fold it into this idea and how AI technologies enter these spaces and the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I think from my perspective, it's important to know that the work that I do, it's always at the intersection of digital equity research, but also practice, right? So we talked about those people and people who do the work in public libraries and in communities, but also the policies, right, that get shaped both at the national level as well as, state and local levels that impact all of it, right? So, but really from my work, I'm really thinking most of all about the individuals, the families who don't have access to technology and their needs. Everything that I do in my research is hopefully to be in service of those folks ultimately.
I wanted to jump in and if you could give context into what are you seeing this digital gap or what's happening? Can you bring us into an example or so?
Sure, absolutely. Also, just kind of backing up, it's probably important to note that my background actually started as a practitioner, as someone who was working in a community technology center. So before I became an academic, I was working in a community technology center, helping people in a public space, very concrete needs that people continue to have all these years later. I'm just more on the side now of doing that research to help elevate those stories, because I think for those of us who have access to technology, devices and everything, we sort of forget, right, that there are people in our communities who don't have this same kind of access as well as the skills. And I think to your question around AI, that's really a big piece of it. Is the skills piece is one facet of the connection between digital equity or digital inclusion and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it makes me think of when I was working during COVID-19, in the first wave of the pandemic and into the second wave. I was a director of curriculum and evaluation for an educational nonprofit, and our core programming happens in the summertime, and it's an incredibly immersive in-person program, and we had to shift it to online. And
Right.
And the students it's for 6th through ninth graders, and tend to be first generation students, tend to be students of color in a high urban area. And what we saw was when we shifted online that a majority of the families needed hotspots, and we had to crowdsource our funding, just getting the students online. And it just makes me think of that as we progress in this space. There is the question of how do we give people access to broadband and tools and access to digital literacy skills.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, one of the things that, in the digital inclusion, digital equity space that we've been saying since the pandemic is that, unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic was one of the best things that could have happened to raising awareness about the digital inequality as a national crisis, quite frankly, because there are still so many people who cannot afford access to technology or, again, the skills needed to be able to use those technologies effectively. But one of the things that was striking for me was their narrative around the way that sort of a private problem became more public, because you could see people, you could see your neighbors in parking lots of public libraries and schools because they had nowhere, they still needed access, right? They didn't have access at home. And fortunately for those individuals who could go to public libraries or schools where those public libraries and schools left their Wi-Fi on, right, so that people could still connect, actually, it drew attention to the national media. And I think that really helped, unfortunately. It's sort of a sad way to talk about it, but it helped more people to understand and see this as a national problem that needed national investment.
There's a question that I have. I want to ask, where are you in this conversation in terms of what are you wrestling with right now?
Yeah, well, I think the big thing that I'm wrestling with is the fact that billions of dollars that were about to be, provided to communities all across the country, and including tribal communities and, our territories, has been canceled. Right. So billions of dollars that was allocated through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021, which was signed into law by President Biden, of course, was one of the things that was shut down by the current administration. And it's really, really unfortunate because the fact that a program like this, and actually it was a total of $65 billion. And the reason why it was so much money is because it's so expensive to bring high-speed internet to homes, literally to put the fiber or put high-speed internet into the ground and run those cables to families that may live in rural areas that might be miles apart from each other. So it's, we're thinking of, sort of in rural community where you have one home, and, bringing that fiber internet connection to that one home, it's about return on investment for a lot of these broadband companies. And that's what's prevented a lot of this infrastructure development. And so it's really unfortunate that the digital equity piece of that 65 billion, that was much less. I think it was about, 0.5 billion or something like that. But still would have provided millions of dollars to, again, every state and territory to do this work we're talking about, the work that you did, sort of, helping to connect families during COVID with hotspots or providing classes. States had done this work to prepare for several years, to prepare, doing needs assessments, to understand where the challenges are. And right when really states were about to roll out these grant programs, unfortunately, the administration canceled it. So unfortunately, we're stuck now in a place almost pre-pandemic. We're sort of having been forced to think back to where we were when the problem was exposed, but now with a recognition that from the federal government, at least, that investment is not a worthy investment. And so that's what's troubling me right now. Or that's where my head is right now. But at the same time, the work continues and you have to keep moving forward. So
you have to keep moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that from the work that I do, I mean, it continues whether there are national investments or not in the work, right? So as researchers, right, we are always looking to, or at least I'll speak for myself, sort of, looking to do research that will continue to, one, elevate the issues for community members who are most impacted by the digital divide. I still think we need to do a lot more to think about how do we do intersectional analyses of people's, multiple intersecting identities in this space, because we know from, for example, census data or traditional kind of sociodemographic data, it's very siloed, right, across race, class, gender, and other identities. But we don't have, I think, enough research in this space to sort of understand how, for example, an older African-American woman who is low income is what her unique, not just challenges, but also opportunities in this space, right? To sort of imagine how technology can, as you said before, how it can be designed to best, accommodate her lived experiences in this space, but also what are the unique needs that can help inform digital equity programs? People don't have access, and there's 25 years of research on this space, but at the same time, how much are we listening to people and representing their unique perspectives in the work? So yeah, those are a couple things that I've been thinking about.
I want that last question that you posed. How are we listening? Can you say more about that, or bring us into it? Because it does relate to the article that you just recently published in the Journal of Participatory Research Methods. And I'd love to zoom in on that.
Sure. I think that, and as you know from being in the space too, that really the wonderful thing about participatory research, participatory action research, is it really works as an approach to research to involving those most impacted by an issue as one sort of use or approach to using PAR, participatory action research. And in the digital inequality space, the digital equity space, that's incredibly helpful, because as we think about developing a digital literacy class, right, whether it's an AI class or, another skills program, we need to understand first and foremost, what are the needs of those who might take that class, right? Rather than assuming we know the answer already, because we think about, say, for example, ourselves and sort of, I know how to use an iPhone. So if I'm going to teach an iPhone class to people who have never used an iPhone before, I'll teach it from maybe my perspective of like, well, I know what I do when I, open up my phone and do things. But that's not including or even considering someone else's starting point for picking this thing up. I think PAR and action research approaches really allow us to listen. It actually forces us to listen beyond ourselves and our own experiences.
What are the questions that are emerging for you? I know you spoke about what you've been holding, what you've been wrestling with, and the complexity of that wrestling within current political landscape. Thinking also of, what do you want people listening, connecting with your work to understand, about these issues?
I think that, again, what I'm always hoping is that people can learn more about how big digital inequality in our country is. It's a huge problem. And I think that through my work, if I can help through data and evidence show how big a problem it still is, then more people can kind of join the process of addressing it as a national problem.
Completely. I am curious. I'm curious about what helped you make that shift. I mean, were you always, even as a practitioner, hey, we're going to co-design, I'm going to bring bring in the voices of this work that I'm doing collaboratively way back when, the 15 years ago, 20 years ago,
No.
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 Okay, so
No,
can
it
you,
wasn't.
I'm wondering if it would be helpful to speak a little bit about that and what were some of the turning points that helped you shift into this?
Right.
What led you to want to do that?
Virginia Eubanks is the short answer. For those who don't know who Virginia Eubanks is a scholar in women's studies, the State University of New York, SUNY Albany, and I read her work. I read her work when I was a PhD student at the University of Illinois. Her stories of her work in this space completely kind of opened my mind to all of this, to thinking, why would we include people, right, in co-design for digital literacy programs, AI literacy? Like, why should we do that, right? And the reason why her work was so impactful, we actually brought her to the University of Illinois when her first book came out.
Wow, so cool.
And yeah, it was great.
I bet you were just like, were you starstruck at all? Like, how was that?
100%. Yes. I was like, fanboy. It was amazing. And it was so great because what she said to, the audience when she was doing a book talk is she said that the way that she was doing work before her book, that she had got it all wrong. Like she sort of admitted that she was wrong. And that is the one thing that just not only kind of blew my mind at the time, because I was also a practitioner, right? I was working with people in a public computer lab. She was doing that as well. And to hear her get up and say, I was wrong, right? Like I was doing this all wrong. Like you never hear that, right? From a expert, right? From a, PhD, like academic scholar. You rarely ever hear someone say, I really had it all wrong. And I had to change how I was thinking about this work so it was more inclusive of the people who I thought I was trying to help, right? So she talks about in her book this example of working with women at the YWCA in upstate New York, designing a digital literacy class for them. So what happened is she created this class and, she was working with staff at the YWCA to offer this class to the women who, participate in programs regularly, who are active. But when they sort of opened the doors and to sort of expect people would show up, nobody showed up. Nobody came. Right.
Okay. There we go.
And she was like, well, we were working together. We thought, I thought this was like, we were good. Right.
Yeah.
And so that for her was a moment where she was like, wow, I have a lot of assumptions clearly about what I think this should be, but I'm not listening to actually the women themselves and what they need. Right. And so she talks about this incredible example, and it's in her book, several illustrations of the digital divide. And these were sort of illustrations about the division between sort of the haves and have-nots. And one of them that was so wonderful is labeled sort of equal exchange of knowledge between the haves and have-nots. And it's sort of, this one of the women in the program said, this is not about the haves and have-nots. That may be like, in terms of technology or material aspects about like wealth and all this kind of stuff. But it's not about what I know and what they know across the divide. So the digital divide, in order to bridge the digital divide, it should be about an equal exchange of knowledge between the haves and have-nots. And I think that's a great example of why PAR in participatory action research is so important, so that we can include the knowledge of those who, might be on another, maybe across different divides, right?
Yeah.
So these stories and her experience were just completely like, blew my mind. And I was like, I've been doing this all wrong too.
So then what happened next?
Well,
you've got me hooked in the story.
I know. That's the thing that I think was so terrifying at the time, right? Because here I am like a couple years into my PhD program and all of this, and I realized like it's just like fear, because I
Mm.
was like thinking back, like, my gosh, how was I doing it all wrong?
Yeah.
Right? So that it was just this deep reflection on and a lot of self-searching and
Mm-hmm.
self-development and sort of a critical approach
Mm-hmm.
to, to moving towards a more like reflective and inclusive and equitable approach to this work. That work, that self-reflection work should really never end, right? In
Mm-hmm.
terms of, thinking
Mm-hmm.
about how you engage with people in the world that may
Mm-hmm.
come from very, very different backgrounds as yourself. Like I have a lot
Mm-hmm.
of privilege,
Mm-hmm.
right? And a lot of power as a tenured faculty member in one
Mm-hmm.
of the top schools in the country in my area, that I need to
Mm-hmm.
constantly check, that privilege that I have if I think I'm going to continue to do this work in meaningful ways. So,
But it's such an important lesson of first you have to go within. And it is something that we have to think really intentionally about as participatory action researchers, where all the power that we hold and bring, the relational, institutional assumptions of our role as researchers, and when we do have advanced degrees and doctor in front of our title, what does that hold?
right.
And how do we
Absolutely.
shift it? What you're saying, is that shift into the space of every person we interact with in all spaces holds valuable lived experience, lived knowledge and expertise, and not one is more important than the other.
Yeah, and I think that absolutely. And I think one of the things, so when I teach sort of, these sort of more participatory
Mm-hmm.
approaches to, digital equity, to digital literacy in the classroom with my students, over the years, I've always said that, the very, very beginning of an engagement is the most important thing, right? I
Mm.
mean, that's where the listening comes in.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the, sort of the trust gets built at the beginning, right? You have to
Mm-hmm.
build trust with someone you're co-designing with, right? And particularly if you've, kind of dropped out of the sky into a
Mm-hmm.
community that's not your own, and people don't know who you are. They just know you're, from a university, and they're not maybe from a university.
Mm-hmm.
That you have a lot of, there's a lot of stereotypes of me when I walk into a space. A lot of harm that can be done
Yeah.
in a space if I just walk in and sort of make assumptions about who else is
Yeah.
in the room.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that, right, is so important. Those beginning
Yeah.
conversations before you enter into any kind of co-design or participatory project are so important.
How do you, because I'm so curious now, how do you teach digital literacy now? What's your approach to it, or what are you thinking about it now, especially as the conversation is unfolding and shifting? I'm really curious about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so the good news is that through the National Digital Inclusion Alliance as a, national organization, which I've been involved with since the organization started, and
Cool.
they represent digital inclusion practitioners, right, across
Mm-hmm.
the country, because of that sort of big umbrella that kind of includes, all the work that public libraries and other organizations that teach digital literacy, are involved with. That
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of examples of digital literacy classes is my point. But I think that to answer your question in terms of, working with my students to develop
Mm-hmm.
a digital literacy class, it is in the spirit of like the Virginia Eubanks approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we use critical pedagogy to
Mm-hmm.
develop a digital literacy class?
Mm.
How would you involve the students of your class? How do you involve them in the design and the development and the implementation of that class? It's what I took away from, Virginia Eubanks' work, is that, one of the things that she always says is like, everyone's a technology expert, right? Because everybody has had some,
Mm-hmm.
engagement or been impacted by technology. They just might not be aware of how the technology has impacted them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a digital literacy class is that perfect opportunity to say, how do we actually assume that, how do we actually approach our students as technology experts
Mm-hmm.
and teach a class to experts? And so I'm trying to encourage them
Mm-hmm.
to say, wow, how do you teach someone that may already be an expert but doesn't have the words that you do?
I'm prepping for the fall for my digital literacy course. and it's with undergraduate students. And I have been working consciously on how to weave more participatory co-design into my teaching. And one, that's a journey I've been on for, I don't know, over a decade of getting more and more co-designing. And it's hard with my undergrads. It's different. And this course in the fall, they're first generation students and first year students. And I've been thinking about what you're inviting into this conversation of digital literacy and co-design. I've been starting that work with co-designing our AI policy and using that as a space for us to slow down and really think intentionally about what are the values that we're bringing, what are our concerns, our questions, our assumptions, and use that to drive that. But I'm just thinking of, as people, practitioners, teachers, educators in K-12 settings or higher education might be thinking about digital literacy. How do I weave digital literacy in the course? How could you help me maybe slow down, or questions to invite in my practice for how I should approach teaching digital literacy through a critical, pedagogical, participatory action research paradigm approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think one example, sort of the beginning of all my classes now, I co-design community guidelines with my students, right? And giving them sort of a framework in the beginning, and then giving them different examples of things to think about, having them get into small groups and discuss what's missing, right, from the community guidelines, to say, what do we agree with? What do we not agree with? And by the end, they've each contributed in their own group additional insights, or tweaked sort of the starting point of the community guidelines for the semester. And then I work on that. I incorporate all the feedback. And then that second week of the class, I say, okay, here's our co-designed community guidelines for the semester. And at any point during the semester, if we have any questions about how we're engaging with each other, or if we don't feel as welcome as we might want to feel, we should go back to these guidelines and make sure they're still holding up, right? Like the things that we agreed with in week one, making sure. So I wonder if sort of an approach to developing, community guidelines could be used to create an AI policy for the class with students. I wonder, though, if there's even sort of, I don't know, my colleagues probably can think of examples of this, but there's been so much work on developing AI policies, right? Yeah. That I wonder if there's alongside the policy, there are examples of impacts of that policy, right? Like things that have gone right and things that have gone wrong from implementing an AI policy that could just deepen that sort of engagement with the exercise for students. So they're like these policies have implications, right?
Yes.
And not to say it's like good or bad, but more just sort of, some more, something to kind of chew on, so to speak, so that they're really thinking that it's sort of an investment level, right, for themselves.
It is.
In this activity, to think about like, oh gosh, like what we come up with now could really have impacts on the rest of our semester and how we're thinking about AI,
Could you share a little bit about some of your impact evaluation and why you want to bring that conversation in with this example with the undergrad students, because you do this work through kind of evaluating the lens of impact too. And
yeah. So, it's such a tough conversation. First of all, let's start there, whether it's policymakers or private funders who fund this work. People want to know sort of like what happened as a result of this work, right? And how were people's lives improved? How did was this investment worthwhile? Whatever, pick a question. But I think that it's a difficult conversation, because I think in some ways it's the same conversation as what we were just saying in terms of people's assumptions as teachers versus students, and sort of what I don't want to be too abstract here, but sort of what they might think or feel about the purpose of doing an evaluation. right?
Yeah.
Like who's it for? It sounds like you and I have probably both been in the situation where, we tell a funder, well, the project sounds great. You want us to come in and develop an evaluation framework,
Yes.
but convincing the funder that you need to actually slow down, right, and include community members in that evaluation
Mm-hmm.
framework, developing a theory of change, convincing them that that's important. I think that it's really communicating that the project will have, I think, a more meaningful outcome if you are including the voices and perspectives of those who are most impacted, in my case, digital inequality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Including them into that picture, because otherwise we might miss things,
Yeah.
right? We might just miss measures, developing certain ways of kind of understanding, and that it can just in the end be a more impactful project.
Let's say you've been doing this, either you're starting out and shifting into participatory action research design, and you want to co-create whatever initiative with community members, and you're bringing that in, and then you've got a funder, and now you're navigating, as an action researcher, you're both navigating the community members that you are collaborating with, maybe university institutional needs, if that is a part of it, also funders and their needs that are part of it, and you're translating the different language while you're keeping your language
Yeah.
really on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And you're watching how different care holders are going to approach this. And they're not always going to approach it through the lens that you're really hoping that they will. And trying to get everyone to understand each other is a really complicated task in this work. It doesn't all fall on the action research shoulders, but it can feel like that.
It reminds me, like, project management and like who does what when matters maybe even more
Mm-hmm.
than a typical project, because I mean, for the very basic point of, we know, like, what are we asking of community
Yeah.
members to do, I think, because
Yeah.
you're really, really attuned to, like, communication matters, as you said, so much more, whether there's translation work involved, but also just like being really attuned to other people's needs, right? And yeah, it's a very different way to, one, engage in research, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I think it also just leads to, as we've been saying, the opportunity to just learn so much more.
Are there anything that you want to bring up or talk about, with your work, or you want more time to kind of sit with, or anything? Or
No, thank you. Gosh, like 100 different things just went through my head. So, no, I think one thing I will say is that, at least in my field of library and information science, one thing that I'm really excited about and hopeful for is that there are more researchers. So I think there's a lot more interest. There's a lot more, yeah, just sort of like excitement about doing this type of work. It's my job and the sort of older, a group of us, to help make it easier for, folks who are coming into the space to be recognized for the work. I was hired just at the beginning of this year into a position that was about engaged scholarship. And so I was very, very fortunate to be hired into this position that is focused on everything we're talking about today. But also how to create more space within, higher ed and academia to accept this type of work, right? That's the thing that I'm thinking a lot about right now and kind of excited about is, how do we create more room, and how do we have it be more accepted that action research, or participatory action research, whatever you want to call it, is not like this kind of throwaway approach to research. It can be taken seriously. It is serious research, and in some ways, from what we've talked about today, it demands maybe even more expertise and knowledge to be able to do this work, because you're navigating multiple spaces with community partners. That is hard, right? So that's all to say, actually, that I am excited, that I think there are, just the fact that you reached out to me about this podcast, and that you've been doing this work for a while too, that there are a number of us who are doing this work, but it's, how do we institutionalize it so it becomes more accepted and more welcomed and just more natural part of the work that we do as researchers.
Well, then there's another question of how can I grow my capacity for inclusive design?
That's right. Yep.
And co-design that, and
Yep.
what might be made possible if I look at other methodologies.
Just adding to what you're saying, though, I think, the thing that is special about this approach is that you have to be someone who's willing to decenter yourself in the work, right? And to really start by listening and to thinking about other people's needs and perspectives. And you have to walk into a potential, an engagement with a research project or a problem that someone or group might have or community might have, and say, how can I leverage the skills that I have, and how can I use them to be helpful? And you also have to know that it's okay if you're not wanted in that space.
Yeah.
Then you leave. So I think that's also, like, in terms of even thinking about designing technology, we haven't, we touched upon it a couple times, but that sort of, like, how do we know that somebody really needs or wants this technoloology?
I'm so glad you're going to that. I'm so glad you're bringing that up.
And that's a piece of this as well.
Can we just have like can we
Sure, yeah,
slow
absolutely.
it down. Okay, bring me in. Where are you going with it?
Yeah, no, I just, I think that the digital equity should include conversations around the design of technology and its implementation in and with the same communities that we might develop a digital inclusion intervention with.
Yeah.
And that's also a whole other area that there are people working on that, right? Particularly from like a privacy and security research perspective. There's a lot of great work in the sort of social justice movements of people doing that work. Design justice, for example, right? Sasha Costanza-Chock's work is amazing. She talks about design justice as an incredibly, we have to include people in the design, particularly those who, have traditionally been harmed by technology. But that this is more important now than ever, that we extend as PAR researchers, thinking about, particularly if you're focused on digital equity or digital inclusion, thinking about design justice in this work as well.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about some of the listeners, viewers who are tech developers, and what questions can we invite in thinking about this design justice or participatory approach in this. I'm thinking of what could we raise and offer for those that are in that tech software programming space of these emerging technologies. I'm curious what we
Yeah, and I think it's the same pieces around. Well, I think there's one question which I always sort of wonder if I was a technology designer or developer, is how do I know that this is really needed? How do I know that this idea that I have for a new technological system is really needed? But it's also like, who's it for? Who does it benefit? Who do we think it's going to benefit? But also not just benefits, but harms. And that's the design justice approach, right? It's what harm will come from a technology system that I develop, whether it's environmental, whether it's, from AI, whether it's social, in terms of communities that may be impacted in ways that a technology designer might not have ever even imagined. Like, how can we just make sure? And one way is by co-design. I think that's, what we're talking about today is, more helping to ensure more benefits than harms through the design of technological systems.
What do you think is obstructing us from asking that question, or a tech developer asking that question?
So I have a snarky response, and then
snarks are all welcome. This is about equity. We welcome all kinds.
Yeah, but shiny is always really fun. And so, and the possibility to make a lot of money, or to be the first, or, whatever it is that might, that often gets kind of wrapped up in this sort of progress narrative around technology, is really addictive, right? Like, thinking in this way is very, like, it hooks you in. And I think what we're talking about today with our conversation is a different way of thinking about the same things, but approaching them very differently. It's really easy in the work that I do to do more harm because of my positionality. And that just, it forces me to be more thoughtful in terms of how I engage with my background and how I exist in the world.
There's no simple solution. And even the solutions or what we're raising is by far the most complex, because it requires a deep unlearning and within traditional systems, within traditional approaches. And I think we're on agreement that the more that we can do with than for shifts us in spaces where we're going to have more inclusive design, access.
Well, I think the work can be more impactful.
Yeah, going back to that. Yeah.
And I think that's, for me, what keeps me bringing me back to this approach, is that the impacts of this approach are very different than if I had done it a different way. And I
have one question before we close.
Okay. Yeah.
So before we close, what question do you hope we keep asking about who shapes these technologies and the futures they create?
Yeah, I think it really just goes back to, how do you know that it's the right thing to do and to spend your time doing, right? Like, what evidence do you have? Like, how do you know and why? I think it's just, asking those critical questions.
My go-to is, I think that's the question, right there. How do you know what you're doing is ethical, responsible, right?
Well, and obviously the reason why I say that is because the more people you include through an action research project, that answer from the beginning, right? Like, the community, like the people have actually said to you, this is what I want. But I want you to remember that this is the way in which, or why I want it, right? Yes. And then I think it's those moments that invite the potential for disaster.
Yeah.
Or otherwise. And, just to kind of question, are you incorporating, not to be too academic here, but other ways of knowing into the way you're designing technology?
I appreciate that. I think that's what we need to be sitting with as we're engaging with these technologies, as we're developing these technologies. We need to be holding as we interact with these technologies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Colin. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, this has been great.
Totally.
Thank you. Thank you so much.